In the vast darkness of space, where civilizations rise and fall like distant stars, there exists a truth that echoes through every corner of the galaxy: there are lines that should never be crossed. The Terran species had drawn such a line long ago, carved not in stone or sealed in treaties, but burned into the very soul of their collective consciousness. For 300 years, the galaxy had learned to respect that boundary, understanding that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their numbers, it was their capacity for restraint. But restraint, like any dam holding back a raging flood, has its limits. When the transmission reached Earth, crackling through subspace with the desperation of a dying breath, it carried with it the weight of a choice that would reshape the galaxy forever. The message was simple, delivered in a child's voice that trembled with terror: "Please, they're hurting us. Please come home." The general who received that message had fought in 16 campaigns across 12 star systems. He had negotiated ceasefires with warrior races and broken sieges that lasted decades. His hands had never shaken while signing death warrants for 1,000,000 soldiers, and his voice had never wavered while delivering news that would break families apart. But, as he reached for the emergency beacon that would awaken something humanity had sworn to keep buried, those same steady hands began to tremble. Because he knew that once that signal was sent, there would be no going back. The galaxy would finally see what humans became when someone touched what they held most sacred. The line had been crossed. And hell itself was about to follow. The emergency session chamber beneath Terra Station buzzed with tension so thick it seemed to have physical weight. General Marcus Thorne stood at the center of the circular room, surrounded by holographic displays showing star maps, fleet positions, and casualty reports that painted a picture of systematic horror across the outer colonies. Admiral Sarah Chen leaned forward in her chair, her weathered face etched with disbelief. "General, are you absolutely certain about these reports? The implications of what you're suggesting?" Thorne's jaw tightened as he gestured to the central display. Three-dimensional images rotated slowly, showing burned settlements, mass graves, and structures that had once been schools and hospitals reduced to smoking rubble. "I've verified them 17 times, Admiral. The Zephyrian Empire isn't just attacking our outer colonies anymore. They're targeting civilian populations specifically. Children, elderly, medical facilities. They're not trying to conquer territory, they're trying to erase human presence entirely." The silence that followed was deafening. Around the table, the most powerful military minds in human space stared at evidence that challenged everything they thought they knew about interstellar warfare. For 3 centuries, conflicts between species had followed unwritten rules. Military targets, strategic installations, resource planets, these were acceptable losses in the grand game of galactic politics. But what the Zephyrians were doing went beyond warfare. It was extermination. Colonel Hassan Okafor, head of Colonial Defense, spoke first. "How many casualties are we looking at?" "New Geneva Colony, population 47,000. No survivors found." Thorne's voice remained steady, but those who knew him could see the storm building behind his eyes. Meridian Station, 12,000, including 1,500 children at the orbital school. New Shanghai Settlement, 31,000 civilians, plus an unknown number in the underground shelters that were deliberately collapsed. The numbers hung in the air like a death sentence. Each figure represented not just a statistic, but entire communities that had been wiped from existence. Families who had traveled across the galaxy to build new lives, only to find themselves facing an enemy that showed no mercy. Admiral Chen's aide, Lieutenant Torres, looked up from his datapad with pale features. "General, we're receiving new reports. The Zephyrian fleet has jumped to the Kepler 442 system." "That's where?" "New Edinburgh," Thorne finished, the words coming out like a prayer. 120,000 colonists. Including the Children's Medical Research Facility. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Officers began speaking over each other, discussing fleet movements and response times. But Thorne stood motionless in the center of it all, staring at the tactical display as if he could will the enemy ships to disappear. New Edinburgh wasn't just another colony. It was humanity's hope for the future, a world where children with genetic diseases came to be healed, where the brightest minds worked tirelessly to ensure that no human child would ever have to suffer needlessly. The Zephyrians knew this. They had chosen their target with surgical precision, understanding that attacking New Edinburgh wouldn't just inflict casualties, it would break something fundamental in the human spirit. "Sir," came a quiet voice from across the room. Communications specialist Davis held up a trembling hand, her earpiece crackling with static. "We're receiving a transmission from New Edinburgh. It's a child, sir. A patient at the medical facility." The room fell silent as Davis routed the transmission through the main speakers. What emerged wasn't the crisp, professional report they were accustomed to, but the terrified whisper of a young girl, maybe 8 years old. "Hello? Is anyone there? The bad aliens came to our hospital. They're hurting the doctors. They're hurting everyone. Mama said if something bad happened, I should use the emergency transmitter. I'm hiding in the medicine closet, but I can hear them outside. They're laughing. Please, someone help us. Please come home." The transmission dissolved into static, but the silence that followed was more deafening than any explosion. General Thorne stood perfectly still, his hands clenched into fists so tight that his knuckles had turned white. Around him, battle-hardened officers wiped tears from their eyes, while others stared at the floor as if trying to avoid confronting the reality of what they had just heard. Admiral Chen was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, we need to discuss response options. The 7th Fleet could reach Kepler 442 in 36 hours if we know." The word cut through the air like a blade. Thorne turned to face the assembled officers, and those who had served with him for decades saw something in his expression that they had never seen before. The careful restraint that had defined his career, the measured responses that had kept humanity's conflicts contained and civilized, was cracking like ice under pressure. "General?" Chen ventured carefully. Thorne walked to the sealed vault at the far end of the chamber, a reinforced door that none of them had ever seen opened. His hand hesitated over the biometric scanner for just a moment before pressing firmly against the surface. Red lights flashed as the system confirmed his identity, then began the sequence of unlocks that would access protocols that hadn't been activated in 300 years. "Sir, what are you doing?" Colonel Okafor stood, alarm clear in his voice. "The Zephyrians have made their choice," Thorne said, his voice carrying a cold certainty that sent shivers through the room. "They've decided that human children are acceptable targets. That our medical facilities are military objectives. That our colonies are not populations to be conquered, but obstacles to be removed." The vault door swung open with a deep, resonant hum. Inside, holographic displays activated automatically, showing fleet compositions and weapon specifications that existed only in the deepest archives of human military history. Ships that had been decommissioned, mothballed, or hidden away when humanity had chosen to join the galactic community as a civilized species. General Thorne, Admiral Chen stood, her voice carrying the weight of command. "Those protocols were sealed for a reason. We agreed as a species that those methods were too dangerous, too human?" Thorne turned to face her, and in his eyes was a coldness that seemed to draw warmth from the room itself. "The Zephyrians are about to learn why we made that choice, Admiral. They're about to discover what happens when someone forces us to remember who we were before we decided to play nice with the galaxy." He began inputting commands into the ancient console, each keystroke unlocking systems that had been dormant for generations. Around the chamber, displays began showing new information, ship classifications that appeared in no public records, weapons systems that existed in no treaty databases, and personnel files for soldiers who had been officially declared dead decades ago. Lieutenant Torres looked up from his station, his face pale with shock. "Sir, these energy signatures, some of these weapons could sterilize entire star systems." "The galactic community would never." "The galactic community," Thorne interrupted, "just stood by and watched while children were murdered in their hospital beds. The galactic community has had 300 years to prove that civilization and restraint were the path forward. Today, they failed that test. The first authorization codes went through, and somewhere in the depths of space, automated systems began awakening things that had been sleeping in the darkness between stars. Ships that had been disguised as asteroids started powering up their reactors. Space stations that appeared to be mining operations revealed their true nature as military production facilities. And, in hidden bunkers scattered across a dozen worlds, soldiers who had been living quiet lives as farmers, teachers, and shopkeepers received messages that would call them back to a purpose they had hoped never to fulfill again. Colonel Okafor moved closer to the general, his voice urgent. "Sir, please reconsider. If we activate those protocols, there's no going back. The other species will unite against us. We'll be branded as war criminals, as monsters." Thorn paused in his work, looking up at the tactical display where the Zephyrian fleet was still advancing on New Edinburgh. In 6 hours, they would reach the planet. In 7 hours, 120,000 human civilians would be facing the same fate as the colonies that had already fallen. "Colonel," he said quietly, "do you have children?" "Yes, sir. 2 daughters." "Then, imagine them in that medical facility. Imagine them hiding in a closet, calling for help that may never come because we were too civilized, too restrained, too afraid of being called monsters to do what was necessary." Thorn's hand moved to the final authorization switch, a red button that would send signals across human space, activating protocols that would fundamentally change humanity's relationship with the galaxy forever. "The Zephyrians have reminded us of something we had chosen to forget," he continued, his voice carrying a finality that made every officer in the room understand that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered for millennia. "We are not monsters because we choose to be civilized. We are civilized because we choose not to be monsters. But, when someone threatens our children, when they cross the line that we drew in our own blood 300 years ago." His hand pressed down on the switch. Across human space, emergency beacons activated. Hidden fleet bases received their orders. Soldiers who had been living peaceful lives suddenly remembered training that had been burned into their minds decades ago. And, in the depths of space, weapon systems that had been designed not to defeat enemies, but to ensure that enemies ceased to exist, began their startup sequences. The galaxy was about to be reminded why humanity had been so eager to embrace peace, and why their eagerness had been motivated not by weakness, but by an understanding of their own capacity for absolute, terrifying efficiency in war. The general's voice had not trembled when he made the decision. But, as the confirmations began flooding in from across human space, as reports arrived of ships emerging from hiding places that the galactic community had never known existed, Marcus Thorne understood that he had just unleashed something that could not be controlled, contained, or reasoned with. Humanity was going to war. Not the civilized, limited conflicts they had fought for 3 centuries, but the total, uncompromising warfare that had once made them the most feared species in their home galaxy. And, this time, they had 300 years of advanced technology, strategic patience, and carefully controlled rage to bring to bear against an enemy that had made the fatal mistake of thinking that human restraint was the same thing as human weakness. The Zephyrians had crossed humanity's final line. Now they would learn the true cost of that decision. The Zephyrian Supreme Admiral Kethvar had conquered 17 star systems in his 40-year military career. His reptilian features bore the ritual scars of a dozen victories, and his command ship, the Worldbreaker, had earned its name by reducing 3 different species' homeworlds to lifeless rocks. As he stood on the bridge overlooking the approach to New Edinburgh, he felt nothing but contempt for the pathetic human colony that would soon join his growing list of conquests. "Admiral," his tactical officer hissed, forked tongue flicking nervously, "our long-range sensors are detecting unusual energy signatures throughout human space. Multiple ships are powering up across their territory." Kethvar didn't bother turning from his observation of the peaceful planet below. Through the viewport, he could see the lights of human settlements scattered across the continents, blissfully unaware of the fleet of 200 warships approaching their world. Let them scramble their pathetic defense forces. We have crushed their military responses at every colony so far. These humans have grown soft, weak. 300 years of playing diplomat has made them forget how to fight. The tactical display showed the Zephyrian fleet in perfect formation, their ships bristling with weapons designed to crack planetary shields and reduce cities to ash. They had refined their approach through the systematic destruction of 7 human colonies, learning to target civilian populations first to break morale before dealing with any military resistance. But something was different this time. The sensor readings coming from across human space showed activity on a scale that didn't match anything they had encountered before. "Sir," the communications officer called out, his voice carrying a note of confusion, were receiving a transmission from the humans.
It's not coming from the planet, it's broadcasting from somewhere in their capital system.
Put it through, Kethvar commanded, finally, turning from the viewport.
He enjoyed hearing the desperate pleas of species about to be exterminated.
It made the victory sweeter. The main screen flickered, then, resolved into the image of a human male in military uniform. The general's face was calm, almost serene, but there was something in his eyes that made Kethvar pause. He had seen fear in the eyes of his enemies before, and desperation, and sometimes even defiant rage. But what he saw in this human's gaze was something different entirely. It was the look of someone who had already accepted a terrible cost and was at peace with paying it. "I am General Marcus Thorne of the Terran Defense Force," the human said, his voice carrying across space with crystal clarity.
"You are Supreme Admiral Kethvar of the Zephyrian Empire, commanding the fleet currently approaching New Edinburgh." Kethvar straightened, surprised that this human knew his name and position.
Intelligence reports had suggested that human surveillance capabilities were limited to their immediate territorial boundaries. "You have destroyed 7 of our colonies," Thorne continued, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "You have systematically targeted civilian populations, medical facilities, schools, and shelters. You have murdered approximately 237,000 human civilians, including 16,000 children." The bridge of the world breaker fell silent. The human was reciting these numbers not with rage or grief, but with the clinical precision of someone reading from a grocery list. "By the authority granted to me by the Terran Congress and the Colonial Defense Compact, I am hereby informing you that humanity is activating Protocol 7.
You have 30 minutes to begin immediate withdrawal from all human territory."
This is not a negotiation.
This is not a threat. This is a statement of fact. Kethvar let out a harsh laugh that echoed through the bridge.
"Human, your pathetic threats do not," Admiral Thorne interrupted, and, for the first time, something flickered in his expression.
"I need you to understand something. For 300 years, my species has chosen to fight limited wars.
We have chosen to honor treaties, to show mercy to prisoners, to avoid targeting civilian populations. We made these choices not because we were weak, but because we remembered what we were capable of when we didn't make those choices." The general paused, looking directly into the camera as if he could see through space to stare into Kethvar's eyes. "You have just reminded us why we made those choices. You have crossed a line that we drew in the ashes of our own homeworld 3 centuries ago, when we nearly destroyed ourselves because we were too good at killing. You have attacked our children, Admiral. You have made the fatal mistake of assuming that human restraint was the same thing as human inability." On tactical displays throughout the Zephyrian fleet, new contacts began appearing. Ships were emerging from what had seemed like empty space, dropping cloaking fields that had hidden them completely from Zephyrian sensors. But these weren't the sleek diplomatic vessels or the modest patrol craft that the Empire had grown accustomed to fighting. These were warships that belonged to an entirely different philosophy of combat. Where Zephyrian vessels were built to intimidate and overwhelm, these human ships seemed designed for only one purpose: the absolute, efficient destruction of everything that opposed them. They were black as the void between stars, their surfaces absorbing sensor pings and electromagnetic radiation, making them appear as holes in space rather than solid objects. "Sir," the tactical officer's voice cracked with uncertainty, "we're detecting over 300 human vessels." "But that's impossible. Our intelligence reports indicated they had less than 50 ships total in their entire fleet."
Kethvar felt something cold crawl up his spine as he stared at the tactical display.
The human ships weren't arranging themselves in any defensive formation he recognized. Instead, they were positioning themselves in a perfect sphere around the Zephyrian fleet, cutting off every possible escape route. On the screen, General Thorne was still speaking, his voice never changing from that terrifyingly calm tone. "You see, Admiral, we learned something about ourselves during our early expansion into space. We learned that we were very, very good at war. Too good. We nearly exterminated ourselves in conflicts that started over resources and ended with us trying to delete entire bloodlines from existence. We learned that when humans fight without restraint, we don't stop at defeating enemies. We eliminate them so completely that even the memory of their existence becomes a cautionary tale.
More contacts appeared on the sensors. Massive structures that had been disguised as space stations were revealing weapon systems that defied everything the Zephyrians thought they knew about human technology. Energy readings suggested power sources that could fuel entire star systems, all focused on weapons that appeared designed to crack planets like eggs. So we made a choice, Thorne continued. We decided to become civilized. We created rules of engagement, treaties, diplomatic protocols. We built a society based on the principle that every species deserved to exist, that conflicts could be resolved without total destruction. For 300 years, we have lived by those principles, and we convinced ourselves that we had evolved beyond our violent nature. The closest human ship was now within visual range, and Kethvar could see that its hull was covered in what looked like scars, deep grooves, and burn marks that suggested this vessel had seen combat that no Zephyrian ship had ever survived. But the scars weren't random. They formed patterns, symbols, and what looked suspiciously like tallies. Thousands and thousands of tallies. But you, Admiral, have reminded us of what we chose to forget. You have reminded us that we are not civilized because we are incapable of savagery. We are civilized because we choose, every day, not to be the monsters we know we can become. And, when someone threatens our children, when someone forces us to remember what we are beneath all that civilization. The transmission cut to a different view, showing Earth's moon. Structures that had appeared to be mining operations were opening like flowers, revealing weapons that dwarfed anything in the Zephyrian arsenal. Similar revelations were occurring throughout human space, as asteroid mining facilities revealed themselves as mobile weapon platforms, and peaceful research stations dropped their disguises to show their true nature as Fortress-class battleships. You have 29 minutes to begin withdrawal, Thorne said, and now there was something in his voice that made every warrior on the Zephyrian bridge take an involuntary step backward. If you are still in human space after that time, you will discover what 300 years of carefully controlled technological development looks like when applied to the single purpose of ensuring that the threat you represent never threatens anyone ever again. The transmission ended, leaving the bridge of the Worldbreaker in stunned silence. Kethvar stared at the tactical display, trying to process what he was seeing. The humans had more ships than his entire empire's fleet. Weapons that registered energy outputs beyond anything in the known galaxy. And, most terrifying of all, they had kept all of this hidden while presenting themselves to the galactic community as a peaceful, barely defended species. Admiral, his second-in-command whispered, "What are your orders?" For the first time in his career, Kethvar found himself facing an enemy that he didn't understand. The humans weren't posturing or making empty threats. They were stating facts with the calm certainty of beings who had already calculated every possible outcome and found them all acceptable. He looked at the peaceful planet below, where human children were probably sleeping in their beds, unaware that they had just become the focal point of a war that could reshape the galaxy. Then, he looked at the tactical display, where human ships continued to appear from nowhere, their formations suggesting combat doctrines that had been refined through conflicts the Zephyrian Empire couldn't even imagine. "Sir," the communications officer said urgently, "we're receiving reports from across our territory. Human ships are appearing in every system we've occupied. They're not attacking, just waiting. Like they're giving us one chance to make the right choice." Kethvar realized, with growing horror, that the humans hadn't just been hiding their military capabilities. They had been studying the Zephyrian Empire, learning their strategies, mapping their territories, and preparing for a war that they had hoped never to fight. And, now that they had been forced into that war, they were approaching it with the same methodical precision they had once applied to destroying themselves. The general's voice echoed in his memory, "We are civilized because we choose, every day, not to be the monsters we know we can become." As he stared at the display showing human ships surrounding not just his fleet but every Zephyrian military installation throughout the Empire, Kethvar began to understand a terrible truth. The humans hadn't been weak or unprepared. They had been showing mercy. And, now, faced with the systematic murder of their children, they had decided to stop. The monsters were awake. And, they had had 300 years to plan their return to the galaxy. 28 minutes after General Thorne's transmission ended, the Zephyrian fleet remained in formation around New Edinburgh. Admiral Kethvar stood frozen on his bridge,
caught between the impossible choice of retreat, which would mean abandoning everything his empire had worked toward, and advance, which would mean facing an enemy that had revealed capabilities beyond his worst nightmares.
"Admiral," his tactical officer hissed, "the human ships are beginning to move."
The display showed the sphere of human vessels contracting slowly, like a noose tightening around the Zephyrian fleet. But there was something unnaturally precise about their movement, as if each ship knew exactly where every other vessel would be at any given moment. It wasn't the chaotic rush of a battle fleet, it was the coordinated movement of a single organism with hundreds of parts. "Sir, incoming transmission," the communications officer announced.
"It's from the lead human vessel." Kethvar's throat felt dry. "Put it through."
The screen flickered, revealing not General Thorne, but a different human. This one wore black combat armor that seemed to absorb light, and his face bore scars that spoke of battles fought in vacuum and atmosphere alike. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat tone of someone who had long ago stopped seeing enemies as living beings and started seeing them as problems to be solved.
"I am Admiral Kane of the Terran War Fleet," the human said. "General Thorne gave you 30 minutes to withdraw. You now have 90 seconds. Kethvar found his voice. "You cannot threaten the sovereign fleet of the Zephyrian Empire."
"We have allies, treaties." "Your allies," Kane interrupted, "received their own ultimatums 17 minutes ago.
The hegemony withdrew their fleets from human space 14 minutes ago.
The collective recalled their ships 12 minutes ago. The Federation issued a statement disavowing any connection to your actions 11 minutes ago."
His expression didn't change as he delivered this information. "You are alone, Admiral. You have been alone since you decided that human children were acceptable casualties." The bridge fell silent as the implications sank in.
The Zephyrian Empire had built its expansion on a network of alliances and mutual defense treaties.
If their allies were abandoning them. 60 seconds, Kane continued. "I need you to understand something, Admiral. The ships you see around you represent less than 3% of humanity's actual military capability. They are here not because we need them to defeat you, but because we want to give you one final opportunity to choose survival over extinction."
New contacts appeared on the sensors, massive structures dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system.
These weren't ships in any conventional sense.
They were mobile habitats the size of moons, their surfaces covered with weapon systems that could glass entire planets. As they settled into position, their energy outputs registered levels that suggested they could power small stars. "Sir," the tactical officer whispered, "those platforms are generating enough power to destroy this entire star system." Kane's voice continued from the speakers. "For 300 years, we told ourselves that we had evolved beyond the need for total war. We created the fiction that conflicts could be limited, that enemies could be defeated without being destroyed, that mercy was a sign of strength rather than a luxury we could afford only when facing weak opponents." The human admiral paused, and something flickered across his expression, not emotion, exactly, but a kind of tired recognition.
"You have reminded us that mercy is indeed a luxury.
And luxuries are the first thing you abandon when someone threatens your children." Kethvar looked at his displays, seeing not just the overwhelming force arrayed against his fleet, but the careful precision with which it had been deployed. Every human ship was positioned not just to attack, but to ensure that no Zephyrian vessel could escape, no message could be sent, no record of what was about to happen could reach the outside galaxy.
30 seconds, Kane announced. "Admiral, I'm going to share something with you that might help you make your decision. 300 years ago, humans fought what we called the Final War.
We had discovered faster-than-light travel and immediately began spreading across our local galactic region, claiming worlds and resources.
When we encountered other species, we didn't seek coexistence or diplomacy. We sought domination."
The human ships continued their slow approach, their formations shifting with the fluid precision of a dance that had been rehearsed thousands of times.
The war lasted 73 years.
When it ended, we were the only sapient species left in a volume of space containing 47 star systems. We hadn't just defeated our enemies, we had erased them so completely that we had to reconstruct their existence from archaeological evidence just to remember what we had done.
Kethvar felt something cold settle in his chest.
The humans weren't just threatening him, they were sharing their history as a species that had committed genocide on a scale that the galaxy had never imagined. We looked at what we had become, Kane continued, and we were horrified. Not by our enemies, not by the war itself, but by how efficiently we had waged it. How completely we had won. How easy it had been to justify every escalation, every atrocity, every choice that led us further away from anything resembling civilization. The lead human ship was now close enough that Kethvar could see details on its hull. What he had mistaken for battle damage was actually something far more disturbing. The hull was covered with names. Thousands upon thousands of names, etched in neat rows across the ship's surface. Those are the names of every sentient being we killed during the final war, Kane explained, as if reading Kethvar's thoughts. Every soldier, every civilian, every child who died because we chose expansion over coexistence. We carry those names with us as a reminder of what we are capable of when we stop choosing to be civilized. The tactical display showed 0 seconds remaining. Your time is up, Admiral. Kethvar opened his mouth to give the order to retreat, to preserve what remained of his fleet and his empire. But, before he could speak, his sensor officer's voice cut through the bridge. Sir! Massive energy buildup from the human fleet. The space around the Zephyrian ship suddenly filled with light as the human vessels activated weapons systems that defied everything the Empire scientists thought they knew about physics. But, instead of firing, the weapons held their charge, creating a display of raw power that painted the darkness between stars with colors that had no names. This is what restraint looks like, Kane's voice echoed across the bridge. Every weapon you see charged and ready represents a choice we are making not to use it. Every second that passes is another moment we are deciding to be civilized instead of efficient. The energy readings were beyond anything Kethvar had ever seen. Each human ship was generating enough firepower to sterilize entire worlds, and there were hundreds of them. The mathematical reality was inescapable. If the humans fired, the Zephyrian fleet wouldn't just be destroyed. It would be vaporized so completely that not even atoms would remain. But, you need to understand, Kane continued, that our restraint is not infinite. It is not weakness. It is a choice we make every moment, and that choice becomes harder to make every time someone forces us to remember what we used to be. A new transmission came through on emergency channels, a message from the Zephyrian homeworld. The Emperor's voice, usually strong and commanding, now carried a note of desperate terror. All fleets, immediate recall to home systems. The humans they have ships in our home system. They're everywhere. How did they get past our defenses? How did they know about our hidden bases? Kethvar realized with growing horror that the humans hadn't just been preparing for this war, they had been prepared for it for centuries. Every diplomatic mission, every cultural exchange, every peaceful trade negotiation had been reconnaissance. While the galaxy thought humanity was learning to be civilized, they had actually been learning everything they needed to know to destroy their neighbors completely if the need ever arose. Admiral, Kane said, and now his voice carried something that might have been pity. You have a choice to make. You can order your fleet to withdraw, accept that your empire's expansion ends here, and live with the knowledge that you gambled with your species' existence and lost. Or you can give the order to attack, and, in the next 30 seconds, you will discover what 300 years of human technological development looks like when focused solely on the problem of making threats disappear forever. The bridge of the Worldbreaker fell silent except for the hum of life support systems and the quiet beeping of sensors that were registering power levels beyond their ability to measure. Kethvar looked at his officers, seeing his own understanding reflected in their expressions. The humans hadn't just hidden their military capabilities, they had hidden their nature. They had spent 3 centuries convincing the galaxy that they were peaceful explorers and diplomatic negotiators, when in reality they were predators who had simply chosen not to hunt. Sir, his second-in-command whispered, what are your orders? For a long moment, Kethvar stared at the tactical display showing the human fleet. Each ship represented not just a weapon, but a choice that humanity had made to be something other than what they were. And, now, faced with the systematic murder of their children, they were offering one final chance for that choice to matter. He thought of the colonies his fleet had destroyed, the children they had killed, the medical facilities they had targeted. He thought of the 8-year-old girl hiding in a medicine closet, calling for help that might never come. And he realized that in his arrogance, in his empire's certainty that humans were weak and divided, they had awakened something that the galaxy would never forget. "Signal all ships," he said quietly. "Begin immediate withdrawal from human space." On the view screen, Admiral Kane nodded slowly. "A wise choice, Admiral. Your fleet will be escorted to the boundary of human territory and released. Your empire will have one opportunity to negotiate reparations for the colonies you destroyed and the lives you took. If you refuse those negotiations, or if any Zephyrian ship enters human space again, there will be no warnings, no ultimatums, and no mercy." The human ships began to move, their formations shifting to guide the Zephyrian fleet toward the edge of the system. But, as they moved, more human vessels continued to appear from concealment, revealing the true scope of their preparation for this moment. "Admiral Kethvar," Kane said as the transmission began to end, "I want you to remember something as you return to your empire. What you saw today represents humanity showing restraint. What you saw today was us choosing to be civilized. If you ever force us to make a different choice..." The screen went dark, but the message was clear. 3 days later, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session to discuss what historians would later call the Revelation War, not because it involved any actual fighting, but because it revealed truths about humanity that fundamentally changed the balance of power in the galaxy. The Zephyrian Empire, faced with the choice between negotiation and extinction, agreed to pay reparations that would take generations to fulfill. Other aggressive species quietly abandoned expansion plans that might bring them into conflict with human interests. And, across the galaxy, the phrase "crossing humanity's final line" became synonymous with the kind of mistake that civilizations didn't survive. General Thorne stood in the same chamber where he had made the decision to activate Protocol 7, watching reports of human ships returning to their hidden bases and resuming their peaceful activities. The weapons that could destroy star systems were powering down. The soldiers who had remembered how to be monsters were returning to their lives as farmers, teachers, and shopkeepers. But everyone understood that the galaxy had changed. Humanity's restraint was no longer seen as weakness, but as a gift that could be revoked. Their peaceful nature was understood not as inherent pacifism, but as a conscious choice made by beings who understood the true cost of war. The general's voice no longer trembled when he thought about what they had revealed. But sometimes, in quiet moments, he wondered if they had saved their children by ensuring that the galaxy would never again forget what humans became when someone threatened what they loved most. The line had been crossed. The monsters had awakened. And the galaxy would never be the same.